I'm going to just show you a few of the very basic options that you get with any video editing suite. This is about as simple a video edit suite as you get. In some respects it's actually too simple, makes life a little bit more tricky to figure stuff out. But it only really does the very basics. But that is probably going to be enough for getting you through putting a very simple project together for a presentation, at least for now. So what I'm going to do is just guide you through a few of the options that are actually available. This down here is the timeline, and as I showed you earlier, you can have your various elements dragged and dropped into the timeline, and you can move them around and do all sorts of stuff. Further features you can do with pictures and stuff, you can change the time. So if you click on the time down there, I can make it 5 seconds, I can make it 1 second, or I can even change a manual to a manual length right there. So that's fairly simple and straightforward, so there's no real kind of issues there. This is just a case of butting things up basically, and as you can see I've kind of messed around with a few bits, and other options that you actually have are quite useful. So if I select the piece of media, which will be this part of the video, and you can split, so you can find a time code and split it into two. Now that's quite a radical thing to do to some degree. It's useful when you want to cut the size of any particular section right down, just to make it easier to handle, and then you can sort of go in, and the other option is an option called trim. So I've selected this one here by clicking on it, and I go trim, and you'll get these little nubbins down here which you can isolate various little bits and pieces. And I go done, and you can see that that's changed to the section that I've actually trimmed to within that particular section. You see the time has also gone right down. Those are two very basic pieces of manipulation for video footage and for pictures. So that will get you quite a long way along the line. Like I say, this is a very simple package and isn't the most intuitive. It can be a little bit clunky, so you sort of have to work at it a little bit, but nobody's going to be grading you on your video editing skills. This is just for you to be able to present your work as best as possible, as best you can manage. And if there's any questions on any of this stuff, you can feel free to get in touch with me, and I will try to explain further about any of these things that I'm doing here. So next, what I'm going to do is show you on a bit more of a sophisticated piece of software, so you can actually see what the process is doing much more clearly. So now we're going to have a look at some more sophisticated editing software. There are many pieces of software out there, Adobe Premiere, there's Final Cut, there's all sorts of stuff out there. This particular one is Vegas Movie Studio. It's a mid-tier piece of editing software. It costs around 60 quid, and it's one of the more user-friendly pieces of software I've found for the process. Adobe Premiere and Final Cut are far more standard within the industry, and they're very powerful, but they take a lot more practice to get to grips with. Like I say, the basics are more or less the same anyway, but with some things being called something else in different areas of the software, it's a little different to access some of these options. But all of these options should be there, it's just a case of finding them. So we're going to build a little bit of a project here, and it's going to be based on exactly what it is you're watching here. So this will be various components that we're actually going to bring in and build it into a basic video. But first thing we're going to do is have a bit of an overview of editing software in general, and we're going to start off with the preview screen. The preview screen is just where the image that you're actually working with will appear, and it's all based on where this little bar is. so you'll be able to scrub through, and we will see that in just a little while. Also up in the media, in the playback screen, are a few controls: play, pause, stop, back and forward to the start and end, and so on. Up here is the media screen. Any pieces of media that you drop in will appear up there, allowing you to grab them, copy them, replace them in multiple positions on the timeline, so on and so forth. It's pretty straightforward. To add in a piece of media, you can just drag and drop. Now you can do it in one of two ways. You can either drag and drop it into the media bin and it will appear up there, or you can grab and drop straight onto the timeline. This works with audio and video. And here you'll see the timeline, the video preview in action. Much more clear when it's a bit of video, but you'll get the point. Down here we have the timeline where we dropped the particular piece of media. Adding and deleting media can be done either from grabbing from the media box and drop it in, and as you can see we can zoom in and zoom out. On this particular piece of software it's done through the middle mouse wheel. There will be various functions that you can actually use to do this. Quite often it's also the plus and minus key will allow you to zoom in and out. So what we'll do is we'll zoom right in and we'll have a look at a few of the bits and pieces that you can actually do. So obviously zoom, and it tends to zoom in on wherever the timeline marker is. So if I move that over and zoom in, it will center on that. So what we can do, we'll zoom right in and we're going to show one of the basic functions that you can do, which is crossfade. On something like Premiere you have to add in a little widget and it will allow you to put the two things together, and you put the widget across the two pieces of media and define the various things like the time. On this one, like I say, I find this a lot more user-friendly way of doing it. You can see the little number in the middle, tells you how long the fade is. So we've got a 2-second fade here. So you'll get a nice crossover as opposed to a hard cut. Use those wisely. It's kind of important. Using crossfades for everything is not desirable. Crossfades tend to have meaning, specific meaning in the minds of the viewer. Sometimes in case of film it's a passage of time. In the case of something like this, which is an instructional video, it may delineate between two subject matters, for instance. What we can do also in this is add text. On this particular piece of software, all you have to do is right click and insert text media. And there we go. And as you'll see, it will sit on top of the video. The other thing about the timeline is that the higher it is on the timeline, i.e. how high it is on the screen, will indicate the priority of that particular piece of the timeline. So we can change that. We can change the size as well if it's selected all. Go 18. As you can see, that all changes. And you have basic word processor type stuff going on as well. Centering, left and right adjustment, justification. So for the moment we'll just close that. So what we can do, this is one of those areas where it's nice to have a little bit of a fade, is when you have a piece of text coming in, so it doesn't just snap. And you'll see that fade away. There we go. And you can make that a very long fade if you particularly want, depending on how you want the tempo of the piece to feel. So one of the other things you can have you can, with any piece of video and audio, you have essentially the same function but just in different contexts. In video, it's opacity. So we've got a point where the text is at its most clear, it's most solid, and you can take the opacity down and change that. Now if I take that down there, you'll see that the text disappears. It's still there, it's just underneath this particular piece of video. So what I can do is take the opacity down on the visual media and do that. On the audio version of this of the timeline, that is just volume, so you can adjust the volume there. So what we'll do is, if I grab one of the videos I've already done, and you will see that you can scrub the timeline, yeah, and all this fudge down the bottom here is the audio wavelength, or audio waves I should say. So we can play. Now we're not going for an Academy Award here, so right. And again, I can adjust. We're not going for an Academy Award. Adjust the volume. Just using that. Now that is not the only place that you can actually adjust the volume. You can actually adjust the volume from here as well. Even when the device that you're recording on, so we can do that. Only gives you a single file. It's actually something that can be. And we can even mute it. So for instance, if I kind of decided that I wanted the video from this particular section, I'll cut that out for the moment. I can have the video. So they can be best worked with when you understand these things as being very much separate but complementary things. But lose the audio. Very useful if you find yourself in a situation where you have a particular bit that you kind of go, I don't actually want that there, or I've repeated myself, or I just want to cut it out. Lots of ums and ers can actually be cut out doing this sort of process. Because I can even, with this, just take that out, butt that up, and I've immediately lost that bit. So if you have to do any retakes or anything like that, that's one way of doing it. And what we'll do is reinstall that. Reinstate that, I should say. So that's some of the basics on that kind of stuff. What you can do, like you have seen me just right there split the various pieces. So taking one piece of video and making it two pieces, which is very useful for cutting out any flubs or just rearranging any particular piece that you're using. So I can split that and I can split that. The access to the split function will depend on the particular piece of software, but you can grab that stuff and rearrange it as you see fit. It won't make any sense. I'm doing a very, very rough cut here, but the other thing you can also do is just have it so it crossfades. So if I delete that, and then we've zoomed in quite far here, so I'll take that out a bit. There we go. And you'll see there is a crossfade. Very dramatic. See how the shadows move. Okay. Now, one of the things that's actually really interesting about this form of editing is that it is very, very flexible. In old editing, when people were using videotape and other kinds of media like film, there used to be a destructive process involved. You were physically cutting the media. Here, you're not doing that so much. So one of the interesting things, that gives you a lot more freedom and a lot more assurity of not actually damaging what it is you're doing, is that you can actually cut these things like we did before, and I'll show you that here. So we now have a separate piece at the end of that file. However, that doesn't mean that that's all that piece is. So if I copy that and repaste that, This particular file, and what I'll do is I will just move it for comparison, is actually the same as the entirety of this section here. It's just a selection. The computer has made a copy of that section, but it is the same file, so you can actually drag it right out. Now you'll notice a little notch here. That is actually the end of the file, the beginning of the file. If I go the other way, you'll see another notch appears. That's the end of the file. So if I was to overlay that, we'll go to the beginning where I haven't done any editing, you'll notice that the audio is the same here and here because it's the same file. So feel free to play around with this stuff. You're not going to lose anything unless you save it over it. Not speaking about the project there, but the individual piece of media. So there's plenty of flexibility and lots of room for you to make errors. Don't be afraid. Just save your project on plenty of occasions, and you'll be able to recover, at worst case scenario, you'll be able to recover the files as they were. Now each of these particular bits of file, like this here, are individually manipulatable. You can add effects and all that kind of stuff, both to video and audio. And I'll go through a few of the things that you can actually do, because I think it's kind of useful and important to be able to appreciate what that these things are around. So what we're going to do there is add an effect to start with. Now there's two ways to add effects. You can either add it to the track, which means that everything along that particular track will be affected by the effects, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go with the individual event, this piece here. So we click on event effects, and I've added in a few effects, potential effects, as it is so far. So what we can do, and I'll just clear that a little bit, and it's just try and make the be a little bit fudgy. There we go. Make that a little bit bigger. So I can add a light effects array and all that kind of stuff, and it's all alterable via these toggles. I can make it black and white, and I can add a time code. The time code relates to the very specific piece of media that's being used at that time in this case. If you wanted to do a global time code, you can add it in via the track effects. To add effects, you can just click up there and add what you like in, whether it be a sharpen, spherize, which just gives a lens kind of effect to the video output, and all those kind of things. Have a play with them. They're kind of fun, but obviously don't overdo it. If you overdo it, then nobody's going to be able to see what it is you're doing. One of the most powerful things that you can have is the event pan and crop. As you can see here, we have a dotted line which goes around part of the image. That represents what is actually output by the software to the video out, which is this screen up here, your preview. And you can, if you just move that over a little bit, if I grab that, you can see it changes the shape and the zoom of what you can actually see on the output. This is very useful, and the reason being, if we select this point here, I'll grab a random JPEG, stretch that out. Now obviously, because of the prioritization of the images like I described earlier, what you'll find is whatever's higher up on the timeline will blank out everything else underneath it. So say I want to actually just kind of put this on top of that other file, but have the other bit still visible. So what I'll do is I'll click on that, I'll zoom out a bit, and you can, just as a side point, you can change how these things work. We'll lock the aspect ratio, which will preserve the shape. So now when I drag these things, it won't change the shape of it. And if you're feeling particularly deceptive, or you need that part to look like part of the original image, you can scale it down and shift it into place, and now it looks like that's the preview screen, which it's not. So now it'll drop into place. That's a very crude version of it, but it's something that you can do. It's a very useful thing to have. Another thing that you can do, if we add an effect to this, and we will add cookie cutter. This will be called something else on whatever particular software that you're using, but we can add that in and go OK. So now we have, you can see up in the top here, it's cut. It's like it's cut a hole in the piece. And by playing around with the size and position, we can have a whatever effect we want, really. But what we'll do is make that smaller. And bring that up to there. And now you start to see much more what Cookie Cutter can do. It's a very useful little tool. It can really kind of get you out of a hole, so to speak. If we select Cookie Cutter, you can change the shape and the size and all those kind of things. You can even make it so it flips it. And if I was to add pixelation on that as well, you can get a pixelization if you want to cut somebody out of the shot who say wants to be anonymous and that kind of thing. So have a play with the different effects and see what you can get if you feel the need to have that kind of stuff. It's a very useful tool. This is the point where it's really good to point out that it's a really superb idea to make sure that all of your files are stored in an organized fashion. If you need to return to the project, then it's a good idea to have everything in more or less the same place, rather than doing, as I have a horrible tendency to do, having the files just all over the place. It makes it easier for the software to reconstruct the project if you need it. You can set some of the presets in the menus and the likes when you first start your project, and that will make sure that any voice recordings and the like that you make through the software itself are stored in an organized fashion in a single place and are not mixed up with a whole bunch of other stuff. This is true also of the media that you're going to use, whether it be the video files, JPEGs, or individual sound files. It's just an extra step just to make sure that if the worst comes to the worst, you're going to be able to recover your file one way or another, and it won't try to refer to similarly, or rather same named files on another part of your computer. Just bear it in mind. It's not necessarily necessary for everything or everyone in every situation, but it's a good practice to be in. So we got to the part of the process now that you've got everything edited on your timeline to the way that you want it to be done, and you need to have the final file outputted. Now the final file, you want to make it something which is easily transferable between one computer and another. So choose something which is reasonably standard, something that will actually be able to be played by your lecturer or yourself, or indeed your friends. So one of the things we're going to do is just show you right here. Again, this is on photos. One of the things I had just noticed is there is the background music, which you can put in there. You can add that, and you can add some custom audio in there, something that I missed in the previous videos. But we're at the point where we want to actually render this film and get it out there. So this box up here, and many of the more basic programs will have a variation on something like finish video. This right here, it will say something like finish video or complete project or something like that. So we'll click on that. And you've got video quality. You have options: low, medium and high. I would suggest stick with high, generally speaking, unless it's a particularly big one. If you find out it's going to end up to be a 3 or 4 gig file, render it in medium and then just export. It will ask you where you want to put it, and you just put it in there, and it will start the process of exporting. This will take time, depends on how powerful your computer is or your device is. Sometimes it can take a few seconds, other times it'll take 10-20 minutes. Sometimes if it's a particularly big or complicated file, it can take an hour or two, depending on what hardware you're using. One of the big challenges with video editing is just that it's a very intensive process, which is why I have a very powerful computer. Though this software is particularly slow, it's not really designed for an awful lot of heavy lifting, shall we say. But we're already at about 10%, so it's not doing too bad. And I will cancel this for the moment. And we'll go back to the more complicated, the more professional style software. And on my particular setup, it is set to render within a selected area. And the way you do that on this one is you just left click and drag, and you can choose the area that you actually want to render. There is all sorts of settings on these kind of things. You can play around with these kind of things and change them. So once I've selected my area, which is the last video that I was working on, and I just go up to project and it will say render as. Other pieces of software may say export it as, and there's various different terms that the individual pieces of software will use to actually describe what that is. It's usually fairly obvious. Just have a look around. If you have any problems, just Google finalizing project in whatever software it is, or ask me and I'll see if I can help you out. On this, it's a little bit more complicated. You've got a lot more options as to how you can actually output it. But in this occasion, I'm just going to say 6 megabytes per second HD 720p, because I don't need a huge output file for this. And then I would click on render, which I'm not going to do at the moment because I've already got the file on the desktop. But the same process will happen. It'll just go rendering and have a timeline basically as it fill up as it's actually doing the work. So we'll just cancel that for now. But that is finalizing your project, otherwise known as rendering. Always remember, whatever you're doing when you're making these projects, save it as often as you can. Make a change or two, save it. Save it as often as you like. There's nothing worse, especially if you're working off of a handheld device or a tablet, something small that you're really kind of having to fiddle around with on a smaller screen. It's horrible when it goes wrong, because then you lose, potentially an hour or two's work. You just don't want to be in that situation. Save, 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 save. It takes a few seconds, and believe me, you will be thanking yourself if you do that.